Hi Reddit. I'm a woman and wanted to ask men about something I've been thinking about lately. From what I've observed, masculinity is often portrayed negatively. It sometimes feels like this is happening to make more space for feminism. Maybe I'm mistaken, but that's just the impression I've gotten. For example, I recently saw a man greet another man with a very firm handshake. My first instinct was to label it as aggressive, probably because I've been conditioned to see those behaviors that way. But then I thought, why is that a bad thing? Felt masculine, strong, and respectful in its own way. Why is masculinity sometimes treated as something dangerous or toxic? Is it really bad for men to just be masculine around each other? I'm genuinely curious and mean no disrespect. I hope this question makes sense and doesn't come across as weird. I just wanted to understand how men feel about this, especially from your own perspective. Thanks in advance. Story 1. There is always an accepted level of bias against men in popular culture. It is considered acceptable to speak negatively about men, even in professional settings, because it is presumed that men have some advantage anyway, so it is okay to take them down a notch. Masculinity can be labeled as toxic, which dismisses what makes men who they are. Men are seen as bad and women as better. Most people take it well and shrug it off, letting women have their little fun. Typically goes nowhere. However, at a certain point, it becomes annoying and pushback occurs. Story 2. Masculinity is not seen as a bad thing. Being rude and calling that the pinnacle of manliness is the bad thing. Story 3. It seems like you do not understand the difference between masculine, feminine, and aggressive behavior. Most people I know do not think masculinity is undesirable. They do think misogyny and aggression are unbecoming. Story 4. I don't know what to tell you about how you label things. Two men firmly shaking hands is not aggressive. If they do the who can squeeze harder thing, then yes, they are wrong. I do my best to support feminism, be an ally to women, and advocate for their rights. However, I do not feel masculinity itself is negative, nor do I believe it is portrayed that way on its own. Do you have any other examples? Story 5. There are still just brothers being themselves out there, and none of this ever crosses their minds. I do not care what people think about simply being a human being and never think about it. Story 6. 1. There is no longer a standard definition of masculinity. 2. Politics has entered interpersonal relationships and transformed them into a battle of the sexes. 3. Masculinity has been demonized by political forces. Carry water, chop wood. Chop wood, carry water. Story 7. There are elements of masculinity that are toxic and detrimental to men and women. Unfortunately, as the internet does, it takes a legitimate conversation and then exaggerates it to where some people see everything about it as toxic. If you see a normal handshake as aggressive, it might be time to spend less time on the internet. Story 8. I think there is confusion between how certain men act and what masculinity really is. It differs for all of us, but the idea of a forced masculine monolith based on a subset of certain behaviors will never work for half the world's population. I remember my own father constantly lecturing me on how to be a man, yet he never embodied those qualities himself. He did not work, depended on women he dated for everything, was a coward, and barely saw me because he did not feel responsible for me since my mother refused an abortion. Yet he used phrases like "be a man" when I was 8 years old, crying after my friend died in a house fire. This is why traditional masculinity receives a lot of criticism. Story 9. No idea why she is downvoted. There is certainly a lot of indoctrination about men being bad and toxic masculinity everywhere. Various gender studies subtly teach people to despise men and their behaviors. Story 10. Here it is not that much of a problem. However, I think women can get scared of men. Because of that, they have a natural tendency to complain about them or demonize them. It was also marketable, playing on this fear to sell ideas, books, and lure women to jobs that are unsatisfying. Men were portrayed as faulty and evil beings, opponents, oppressors, hiding and preventing things. An enemy to defeat became the motivation. Then it became like the song of the birds, an everyday background noise, an accepted and recognized phenomenon. Also, while people fight each other and think about who are girls or boys, They are divided, separated, and alone. The elite can control and exploit them because they are too busy fighting each other. I think it is funny and cute to be painted as a terrible historical beast. At the same time, it is quite insulting and damaging. Story 11. Why is this happening? Over the last 10 to 15 years, more radical feminists and their supporters have gained positions of power and influence. This has allowed them to spread and normalize their subversive feminist theory ideology, which is basically thinly veiled misandry and female supremacy. They claim it is about equality, but actions speak louder than words. Previously, this was mostly contained to college campuses. The term toxic masculinity is used to pressure men into changing behavior that feminists find undesirable. In the past, we had terms for men who were truly toxic: asshole, jerk, or prick. We could recognize and call them out. But what about when a man is not really being toxic but simply behaving in a way you dislike or that does not personally benefit you? You cannot insult regular people hoping they will change. So, the term toxic masculinity was created to scrutinize every aspect of a man's personality without sounding insulting. Instead, it sounds educated and enlightened. Anyone who disagrees is accused of toxic masculinity, patriarchy, or whatever the latest fashionable buzzword is. It is a clever tactic. It is unfortunate that many have accepted it, including some men. Story 12. The problem is that many people who claim they are masculine or have masculine energy are toxic and horrible. What is worse, most of them are not masculine in any obvious way. People like Andrew Tate are not manly. They just have muscles. He is actually at the level of a truculent adolescent unworthy of any adult's time or attention. Healthy masculinity is represented by Uncle Iroh in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and toxic masculinity is represented by Fire Lord Ozai. I do not know anyone who regards Uncle Iroh in a negative light. Nobody regards healthy masculinity as a bad thing. People regard toxic masculinity as a bad thing, and many horrible people claim that disliking them means disliking masculinity in general. It does not. Story 13. Why are you asking us? How about asking those who criticize masculinity instead of those who are the targets of such criticism? This is like asking the bullied why they think they are being bullied. Why is masculinity sometimes treated as something dangerous or toxic? Try asking the people who oppose masculinity, maybe. I hope this question makes sense and doesn't come across as strange. Yes, it is very strange that you would ask us this, as if we are the ones criticizing our own gender in the media, at school, at work, and online. Story 14. When it is destructive or results in sexism, sexual assault, violence, misogyny, or creates an environment that enables these behaviors, it should be called out. Too often, the socialization that leads to these outcomes has not been questioned. As a man, I am okay with masculinity being subject to scrutiny. Society spends a lot of time criticizing femininity and feminism. Accountability is necessary and positive to effect change. Story 15. According to the feminist movement of the 2010s, which gained social legitimacy, all the problems in the world are caused by men behaving badly. Story 16. Personally, I think assigning gender to behaviors and personality traits is ultimately pointless. Edited to add. After reading some of your comments, it seems you are clear on what you want from a partner, and that is not a bad thing. I am just not convinced by the idea of ranking things on a scale of masculinity or femininity. Story 17. My problem with masculinity is that people who push it as a major buzzword use it to support ideas of being aggressive, misogynistic, misanthropic individuals beating their chests to assert dominance, and usually justify and reinforce harmful stereotypes to promote their products or repeat their worldview. There is a difference between enjoying feeling manly and being the type who uncritically accepts misleading ideas because it comforts them and convinces them they are the real victims since society has unfairly made being a man a terrible offense. Then they spread hate against women and immigrants while marketing ineffective testosterone booster pills. None of that is acceptable. Additionally, there are many resources online explaining what toxic masculinity is and why not all masculinity is toxic. It is harmful for everyone. If you are open-minded and curious, I recommend exploring this topic further as it is quite interesting. Story 18. Masculinity is not toxic and is incredibly important to society. It holds society up. Feminism lost its value years ago when it shifted from advocating for women's right to vote to empowering women over men and being anti-family. It promoted free sex as acceptable but then became upset when sex and women were devalued, because an increase in something usually decreases its worth. That radical perspective portrays masculinity as toxic, but they are wrong and are themselves toxic. There are toxic men and women, and toxicity exists on gendered sides. A toxic man might believe that violence defines masculinity, that driving aggressively in a truck is tough, intimidation is masculine, and leaving a mess in a public restroom asserts dominance. This is a thin veil of toughness over an immature man, a grown man-child wrapped in a steel diaper called a Dodge Ram. Real masculinity is power and violence under control. You can fight, but you use it to protect and defend, not to intimidate. Selflessness, such as giving someone a better parking spot, offering the last slice of pizza, or doing something for others. Showing restraint, mercy, and forgiveness. Being responsible in your life and taking responsibility for your actions. Story 19. It is not. The people who have a problem with masculinity absolutely are the problem. They do not want things to be the way they are. Story 20. Somewhere in the past few years, it became unfavorable to be masculine. The campaign against what is considered toxic masculinity turned into a crusade against being a man altogether. Young girls now feel discomfort from the mere presence of a male, and they are encouraged to think and act this way. Story 21. Because even the slightest criticism of masculinity has long been ruthlessly suppressed, now that a negative comment or two can be found on the internet, men tend to claim that masculinity is under attack. When you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Story 22. Feminism seeks to change society and direct agencies and corporations toward supporting women's natural tendencies. One way this is done is by labeling masculine traits as toxic so that men are de-emphasized. In theory, this creates an advantage for women for their ultimate benefit. This type of messaging is common among feminist women, so it is projected through media and communication campaigns. It has also become associated with politics and education. Story 23. It is quite ironic when you think about it this way. Feminists confused masculinity with tyranny or combined them in their perception and set about feminizing men. Men, always eager to please women, began to abandon traditional gender roles and act more like women. Women, most of whom are not lesbian, found the new girly men unattractive and contemptible. Who would have guessed such a thing would happen? Story 24. Depends on your definition of masculinity. I do not see how a handshake can be considered strong. It is a sign of respect. In this society, it is hard to be a man. We are supposed to be independent and strong and always do what we have to do. To be honest, I have no idea what you mean. Story 25. Jumping on the bandwagon of criticizing every little thing others do, especially neutral actions, and assuming or reframing them as negative will make your future and your life miserable. If you ever take a step back and notice the people around you who are always doing this criticizing, you will see how absolutely miserable and unhappy they are. Story 26. True masculinity has not been the focus of the media in recent years, whether for good or bad. Just take a look at how it is working out. Story 27. Because at some point, some people turned the descriptive term, which was rooted outside the sphere of morality, and expanded it to have implications on moral matters. From then on, people felt motivated to either frame it as good or bad, depending on which narratives they followed. We can see this by how discussions about femininity do not take place at any level near those surrounding masculinity. Summary: it is part of a narrative and an attempt to force everything into a framework of morality, usually with the goal of assuming control in some way, shape, or form. Story 28. I do not think society views those things as bad. It is just a very loud minority that will not stop complaining about it, against a silent majority of people who have better things to do than spend their day talking about how they think things are all right. Unfortunately, this loud minority is playing a disproportionately large role in culture and in raising the next generation. Thankfully, many people, just like you, eventually realize how silly it is. Story 29. Do not confuse masculinity with toxic masculinity. They are different. Masculinity is controlled, protective, and strong. Toxic masculinity is controlling, overprotective, and weak. The first is great. The second is decidedly not. Story 30. Toxic feminism is winning the cultural battle, resulting in increased social conditioning of women around this mindset. That is why completely benign masculine traits and behaviors give you an initial negative reaction. It is good that you observed and questioned your reaction, because that sort of critical thinking is what our society needs more of. Why is this seemingly innocuous behavior giving me negative vibes when there is nothing objectively negative going on? It is just some specific masculine behavior or trait. A lot of men wonder about those sorts of reactions daily from women. For example, women intentionally moving away from them while walking down the street or crossing sides because they see them walking along, moving far away from them at the gym, at the counter waiting to pick up food, or elsewhere. We notice those reactive defensive behaviors, and it bothers us, especially when we are completely harmless. I know female friends who have no history of trauma but act like most men they encounter are rapists just because of this conditioning. They are paranoid to go on dates in public restaurants with dozens of people around them in a completely unjustified way. The level of fear women have created around men portrays everyone as a terrible, violent person. Yes, some men are responsible for that. Otherwise, that would not be there. If you treat all masculinity this way, you will create an environment where men no longer support or respect you at large. The biggest underlying issue to all of this, I think, is our declining level of risk tolerance as a people. We are unable to look at situations objectively in terms of cost, benefit, and risk, and make good assessments to proceed cautiously but not defensively. That is happening everywhere, and it is a bigger issue. But the aversion to risk you see from women around men is just one symptom of this, in my opinion. Story 31. I would not say masculinity is seen as a bad thing. I think certain groups might hold that opinion, but I have never been treated negatively for being masculine. For example, when I protected my now former girlfriend from a man trying to steal her purse, nobody thought negatively about that. Story 32. Masculinity is not a bad thing. Some aspects of it, if taken too far, can be, but the same applies to almost any behavior, masculine or feminine. Story 33. Masculinity is not undesirable, but when it becomes toxic masculinity and hyper-aggressive masculinity, it is definitely undesirable. Story 34. I think the issue may be the cartoonish brother take on masculinity, which is simply a juvenile imitation of masculinity. When that is considered an example of masculinity, it gives the whole thing a cringe-worthy, toxic reputation. To start making the world a better place, we should ban fedoras. Story 35. Masculinity is fine. Toxic, alpha male, manosphere, Andrew Tate-esque masculinity is pathetic. They are two very different things. Story 36. Feminism is a hateful group that pushes propaganda in the media to portray masculinity as inherently toxic. Story 37. This is more for Ask Women. That conditioning you talk about did not come from men. Just kidding, you will not get honest answers from them. Story 38. Depends on the context. If it is the type of masculinity where someone self-describes themselves as an alpha and considers everyone else as beta, then yes, it is incredibly toxic. If it is the type of Chad masculinity where someone helps lift others to improve the general self-worth of their surrounding community, then no, it is actually a good thing. Story 39. I think the real issue is the toxic ideology about what masculinity is. Masculinity itself is not the problem. The problem is the idea that men need to repress emotions and that we all need to be dominant. I have seen soldiers cry, as well as other men who are seen as strong leaders. Are they lesser for their tears? Most people do not realize that the whole idea about dominant wolves was actually based on incorrect assumptions. The researcher who coined the term based his conclusions on observations of wolves in captivity. Wolves do not act like that in the wild. So masculinity is not the problem. Many women desire a masculine man, and society needs masculine men. Story 40. There are many reasons it is hard to distinguish masculine from aggressive in society. Notice how we struggle to even define masculinity without associating it with aggression. It is not a clear distinction of good or bad. There is too much confusion to say that. There are problematic aspects of masculinity because aggression is often encouraged. However, this is not a criticism of boys or men specifically. If social attitudes could recognize masculinity, qualities such as strength of character, resilience, loyalty, hard work, and confidence, separately from aggression, such as a take-what-you-can-get mentality, then we would all be better off. Story 41. I feel that the most important aspect of representation is genuineness, and personal goals should be improvement. Masculinity and femininity are contrived, worsened by how utterly subjective they are. To embody masculinity is to attain its virtues and its flaws, and realistically, the flaws outweigh the virtues in a civilized society. To be proud, to be stubborn, to be taciturn, these are masculine features, but we all know the misfortune of knowing the egotistical blowhard, the willfully ignorant person, the cold companion that shames your humanity. What of the positive traits? The ability to defend oneself in combat? A functional society renders it unused. Mechanical skill? It should be more important, but capitalist trends render it unnecessary. If it were more necessary, it would make more sense for both sexes to acquire it. That is really the gist of the issue. If a good trait is worthwhile, all people should seek to attain it. Courage, compassion, ingenuity. Why should they be gatekept to men for active expression? Story 42. Masculinity can be many things. My problem is with the tough guys trying to gatekeep the meaning of masculinity. Story 43. Masculinity and toxic masculinity are two separate things. Traits like courage, confidence, resilience, and leadership are considered masculine and highly respectable. Toxic masculine traits like aggression, arrogance, misogyny, and dominance do not provide positive benefits to society. Competitiveness exists on the border between the two. Competition in a positive environment involves respect, sportsmanship, encouragement for others to improve, and fairness. For example, Usain Bolt celebrating the successes of his competitors, Daniel Day-Lewis referring to the other nominees for his third Oscar as my equals, my brothers, and John McCain congratulating Barack Obama on his presidential victory. Competition in a toxic environment involves boasting, belittlement, insults, and cheating. For example, Sean Avery threatening other National Hockey League players by waving his stick in their faces, and Kanye West invading the stage when Taylor Swift won her Video Music Award and stating that Beyoncé should have won. Story 44. Because there are now too many undesirable men in developed countries, and suppressing their assertiveness in schools by instilling a submissive role upon them is a way some women attempt to preemptively control their future behavior. Neurotypical women appreciate masculinity, aggression, confidence, and emotional strength, just not from certain individuals. Story 45. It is started by women and men who identify with feminine traits. I have no issue with it. Let me clarify that it is usually initiated by feminists or individuals with extreme progressive views. Story 46. The problem is not masculinity itself. It is the nonsense expressed by people like Andrew Tate and those brotherhood boot camps. They teach ideas that are demeaning and foolish while pretending to be tough. Unfortunately, these individuals influence certain men, especially younger men. That is what people mean when they mention dangerous and toxic masculinity. That dragon kid is more masculine than those men. At least he is expressing it as satire. Story 47. Sounds like a fake or non-genuine post. I think generally speaking, reasonable people just hope to be decent human beings regardless of gender and to live their individual lives freely without overly burdensome and artificial cultural expectations around things like gender. Story 48. It is not and never was. Women are winning the tug of war in Western countries, and weak men are believing the nonsensical propaganda. If you cannot beat them, join them. Story 49. Is it? I'm pretty sure masculinity is seen as a good thing, at least if you are a man. I have never had any issues with it myself. I feel like this is an internet thing. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.